Hello, welcome, and thank you for checking out this episode of Philosophy versus Work, the podcast that examines the ethics of the work ethic and other existential, phenomenological, mythological, ontological, and sociopolitical questions regarding work, life, and death. I am Michael Murray, and I'll be your guide on this philosophical journey. Episode 4, Death by Dasein. All right, no beating around the bush. It's time to start talking about death and dying. Who am I kidding? Of course I've got some more anecdotes and one big definition to throw your way first. When I was a grad student, I was a philosophy TA for 3 courses: critical thinking, deductive logic, and intro to philosophy. The main topic of the intro class was philosophies of death and dying. Yeah, way to get introduced to philosophy. Starting with Plato, and so also the death of Socrates, and Lucretius, and then getting into Judith Butler and Michel Foucault about the body, suffering, precarity, and contemporary ethical and legal scholarship on things like euthanasia and the right to die, or death with dignity legislation. I've long had a somewhat quiet fascination with death. Well, not death per se, but death and dying and afterlife mythologies and philosophies. I was never so goth as to dye my hair black and paint my face white. Well, I have, not at the same time, and not because I was goth. The first was a Connor Kent Superboy cosplay, and the latter was a Joker costume. But I have had a picnic in a cemetery, done some photography in cemeteries, and had some pretty fascinating visits to the catacombs, the Montparnasse Cemetery, the burial vaults in the Paris Pantheon, and Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides. And not to mention, I'm a big fan of museums. Okay, I mentioned in the intro that I had attended an after-school catechism program. Well, I was raised and confirmed Catholic, and an avid-ish churchgoer into my teens. In my final religious education report card, the priest informed my parents he'd not had a student with such a grasp of religious concepts and encouraged them to enroll me in seminary. Not an idea I was particularly fond of, given the life becoming a priest would have entailed. Also, having grown up with Jewish and other non-Catholic friends, it was always in the back of my mind that I could never quite reconcile the idea that good people who had done nothing wrong could and would be punished for all eternity simply for following the, quote, wrong religion. This really stood out after having moved to the South, where Catholics like my family were considered cultists, and Jews, Muslims, and everyone else were a small minority. Now, to be fair, Charlotte has by and large moved on from this since we moved here, but you don't need to go far to find an area where this is still the case. That dissatisfaction left me wanting to explore other options, and I cast that net pretty broadly across history, philosophy, theology, and mythology. And I have found that history has left me grounded, philosophy has kept me questioning, and mythology has left me enamored with storytelling. But nothing in theology ever satisfied my questions regarding the punishment and reward theory of the afterlife. If anything, the deeper I looked into theology, the less I thought of organized religion in general. As an art history geek, though, I have to admit a complicated relationship with religious art and architecture. But I'm sure we'll get to that eventually. I was just listening to an Acid Horizon podcast on Deleuze and Agamben and their competing essays on art and creation, and let's just say I have plenty to say regarding art and work. If I needed to sum up my thoughts on death and slap a label on it, I would say I'm an existentialist. I find the idea that we are condemned to our freedom, and thus ultimately and entirely responsible for our actions, to be the most ethically compelling argument regarding life and death. We are not, by nature, good or evil, saints or monsters, saved or damned. We are simply what we have chosen to do, for good or ill, and, of course, with the caveat that not all of our choices are free. Most of our choices are restricted by one power structure or another. But if our society is to be ethical, we must hold each other, including and especially the powerful,
with great power comes great responsibility,
accountable for those choices. To paraphrase Peter Capaldi's Doctor, without hope, without witness, without reward, just be kind. Now, in the last episode, I mentioned a concept of Heidegger's, Dasein, but didn't want to hammer everyone over the head with definitions for the whole episode, so left that one hanging a little. But since that's coming back up now, let's first unpack it a bit. Heidegger's Being in Time is a 500-page beast in which he lays out the ontology of being, the essential being of being, what a being is, and his basic mechanism is Dasein. Literally, in German, if you break it up, da, there, as in over there, but more accurately as in thrown over there, and Sein, being. And of course, Dasein is a capitalized noun. It is their being. I'll try to be concise here, but thanks to the joys of English homophones and German grammar, this is a little thorny in spoken English. A Dasein is a being, lowercase, for whom their, possessive, being, uppercase, matters. It is not just their being, in the verb form, but their being, in the noun form, that matters to them. It's something they think about, imagine into the future, take pains to preserve, and are generally concerned with its, i.e. their own, continued existence. Also critical to Dasein are its being in the world, its being with others, and especially for our purposes, its being towards death. And yes, of course, those are all hyphenated phrases. Super abridged version. Dasein's being in the world, all hyphenated, is its existential facticity. It's how it is in the world, in reality, as such. Dasein is not a brain in a jar or Neo in the Matrix. It is a real being in the world. It's also Dasein's that which is ready to hand. It's how it is encountered. For example, a hammer is ready to hand as equipment when it is used to hammer a nail, or a pair of shoes are ready to hand as equipment when they're worn, well, as shoes. It is also spatial, in that it encounters others in the world and does so with concern and familiarity. And importantly, it can get lost in this, in its everydayness, in its in-the-worldness, in being fascinated by what is in the world, in its, well, they-self. Regarding concern and familiarity, Dasein encounters the other as with concernful solicitude. The other's being solicits concern. Its being with others is the existential ontological meaning of Dasein. It's phenomenal being as such. It doesn't matter if the other is present or not. Being with is an existential characteristic of Dasein, says Heidegger, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived. In fact, their being away or being missing are only possible because of being with, and Dasein's being alone is only a, quote, deficient form of being with. To try to sum this up, a human being is always already in the world with other human beings, and even being alone is only possible in a specific, spatial relation to others. Others, it is critical to note, that are themselves also Dasein. Dasein's possibilities for being depend on its being with others. Now, if you want to take this in a slightly different direction, check out Emmanuel Levinas, who flips this on its head a bit, somewhat inverting Descartes' cogito, the I think, or I doubt rather, therefore I am, into the other sees me, therefore I am. All right, being towards death. Death is the ultimate, final possibility of being, and as possibilities for being are dependent on being with others, death is one's, quote, own most non-relational possibility, and the issue of concern is one's no longer being with others. Heidegger states, quote, this own most possibility, however non-relational and not to be outstripped, is not one in which Dasein procures for itself subsequently and occasionally in the course of its being. On the contrary, if Dasein exists, it has already been thrown into this possibility. Death is not a possibility one can choose for or against. By virtue of one's existence, one has been thrown into the path of the inevitability of death. One is, factically, already dying. There is no question of if, only when. Thrownness into death reveals itself to Dasein, Heidegger continues, in a more primordial and impressive manner in that state of mind called anxiety. Angst being the German term that Heidegger's using. That in the face of which one has anxiety is being in the world itself. That about which one has this anxiety is simply Dasein's potentiality for being. Anxiety in the face of death must not be confused with fear in the face of one's demise. So, important note here regarding anxiety, Angst, and fear. Fear of one's own end, for Heidegger, is a kind of cowardice, an inauthentic version of being towards death. He's also approaching this as universally applicable. These states apply to Dasein, to a human being a human being as such. So one's individual fears are their own, not Dasein's. With that, two more distinctions. First, anxiety and fear. The common psychological conception of anxiety and fear, that anxiety is without a direct object and fear has a direct object, isn't really what Heidegger is referring to, but it can be helpful to use in contrast. Generally, if I'm claustrophobic, then my fear has an object, enclosed spaces. Or if I have a fear response to seeing a bear on a trail in the mountains, the fear is in response to the bear. There is a clear, even if only potential, danger present to hand, to stick with Heidegger's terminology, that is causing my fear. On the other hand, anxiety typically has no direct object, though it can be general or specific. A general sense of anxiousness, or a specific sense of dread when, say, a loved one calls and says, "We need to talk." Clinical psychologist and author Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, in future tense, notes that, quote, "Whether general or specific, anxiety is what we feel when something bad could happen, but hasn't happened yet. Anxiety arises from projecting oneself into a future." For Heidegger, though, fear is superficial, everyday, in that it is in response. Quote, "Fear is anxiety fallen into the world, inauthentic, and as such, hidden from itself." End quote. Authentic anxiety, on the other hand, is existential to being in the world. It is because anxiety is the existential condition that being in the world, being alongside it, and being concerned with it, that such a being in the world can ever be afraid. Okay, second distinction we need to make is in Heidegger's references to authentic and inauthentic. The aim is to be towards death authentically. Heidegger states, "Factically, Dasein maintains itself proximally and for the most part in an inauthentic being towards death. How is the ontological possibility of an authentic being towards death to be characterized objectively if, in the end, Dasein never comports itself authentically towards its end, or if, in accordance with its very meaning, this authentic being must remain hidden from others?" Quick little side note there. I find that line particularly interesting, this idea that the authentic being must remain hidden from others. Keep in mind, this is being written after the formation of the Nazi Party, but before Heidegger was elevated to the rector position and joined the party himself. As far as inauthenticity, Heidegger is pointing to two crucial problems in how Dasein behaves and thinks. First, that Dasein, in concerning itself with its own being and acting towards continuing to be, puts aside the existential facticity of Dasein's own end, death. Second, that Dasein's general mode towards death is fear of death, and thus avoidance of death in the face of its inevitability. And third, that it doesn't actually appear possible. Authentically, being towards death appears to be a contradiction, in that, quote, "concerning oneself with actualizing means signifying bringing about one's own demise, which contradicts concerning oneself with being. And, quote, if it were done, Dasein would deprive itself of the very ground for an existing being towards death." Heidegger points out earlier in the text that we're only able to know death basically secondhand, because of the other. We can only witness death. We cannot know death. As thinking is part of being, and death is the end of our being, we can't think anything and be dead at the same time. Our being in the world and being with others, the death of the other, evidences the facticity of death. Writ large, the lack of immortality across the whole of human history evidences the facticity of death for all future humanity. Now, it could be argued that's not necessarily true. As Hume pointed out, inductive reasoning, that because X has always happened such and such a way in the past, X will continue to happen that way in the future, is a logical fallacy. And it is logically false to claim that if I flip a coin in the air, it will fall because it has always fallen before. Logically, there is a possibility that at some point the coin won't actually fall if I base that reasoning in my argument on past behavior. Logically, it is only safe to say that because the coin has always fallen before, the most likely scenario is that the coin will continue to fall in the future. Science! We could spend a whole episode. Hell, we could spend a whole semester, and I'm sure scores of philosophy grad students before me have spent entire degrees and post-bac and post-grad research projects on what Heidegger has to say about authenticity. But for our purposes here, I'm just going to try to sum up authenticity regarding being towards death. It is in the anticipation of death, the, quote, waiting for the actualization, that we can come close to understanding what death means as possibility. Death is the, quote, possibility of the impossibility of any existence at all. Death, he states, as possibility, gives Dasein nothing to be actualized, nothing which Dasein, as actual, could itself be. It's a contradiction. Dasein, being a human being as such, cannot be and not be at the same time. Anticipation of death, quote, signifies the possibility of the measureless impossibility of existence. But wait, there's more! And I'm just going to roll with this whole upcoming passage. For those of you playing the home game, we're in Being and Time, Heidegger's pagination 263. Please do not confuse this with the Heidegger drinking game, drinking every time he says Dasein or being. I strongly encourage against this. Unless it's water, maybe? I mean, you'll be super hydrated. One might even say being hydrated. And I hope this episode doesn't become the PVW drinking game. States Heidegger, being towards death is the anticipation of a potentiality for being. As a quick reminder, we're still in the capitalized noun form of being territory. The being, noun, of being, verb. Of that entity whose kind of being is anticipation itself. In the anticipatory revealing of this potentiality for being, Dasein discloses itself to itself as regards its uttermost possibility. But to project itself on its own most potentiality for being means to be able to understand itself in the being of the entity so revealed, namely, to exist. Take that, Cogito. Anticipation turns out to be the possibility of understanding one's ownmost and uttermost potentiality for being. That is to say, the possibility of authentic existence. Now, recalling the earlier definition of anxiety, Heidegger notes anxiety is a basic state of mind that belongs to such a self-understanding, understanding being accompanied by a state of mind of Dasein, that has been brought face to face with the thrownness of its that it is there, face to face with the nothing of the possible impossibility of existence, and now open to the constant threat to itself of its own individualized being, on the basis of Dasein itself. One's own individual being is itself the potentiality for non-existence. If I exist, then I will die. Being towards death is essentially anxiety. Okay, so a last bit on authenticity. Having now defined anxiety existentially, Heidegger summarizes authentic being towards death as such. Anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they-self, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, but of being itself rather an impassioned freedom towards death, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the they, and which is factical, certain of itself, and anxious. So, being towards death isn't death-seeking or sitting around waiting for death, or living in fear of death, avoiding, even mentally, as belief in an afterlife fundamentally requires a denial of the impossibility of existence and a projection of oneself and others beyond the impossibility of their existence. It is a self-understanding and certainty of one's own individual existence, free from the they, no longer concerned with asking for confirmation of one's own existence. validation-seeking to be contemporary, and anxious of one's own end. Now that we have an idea of what Heidegger's being toward death means, what does turning toward death mean? Great question! And we're going to save it for next week. This episode has felt kind of dense, so I'm going to leave some space to chew on it for a bit. Next week, we get back to my meaningful work argument in tackling turning toward death, a little bit of Marx, and a whole lot of Bataille. Till then. If you enjoyed this episode of Philosophy vs. Work, well, you know the shtick. Please like, subscribe, follow, leave a review. It really does help to grow the show. You can stare all you want into the algorithm, but it doesn't stare back without likes and subscribes. Don't forget to check out the show notes for details on any authors, texts, etc. referenced directly in this episode. If you find the project valuable, consider supporting the channel. Or maybe you're feeling generous and just want to support my coffee habit, or keep Keo in catnip. Either way, links to support the channel are in the doobly-doo below. Thank you.